Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and while I might spend most of my time coming up with new ways to give my readers nightmares, the subject of today's video, Dr. Harold Shipman, was a walking nightmare himself, as you will soon see. Today's script was written by the ever-capable Ben Edelman, so be sure to give thanks to him in the comments and tell us whether you're scared of needles. I mean, if you're not, you might be after you watch this. Doctors are among the most trusted members of our society. There's a good reason for this. We entrust them with our most valuable commodity, our health. People share things with their doctors that they keep secret from everyone else, even their closest loved ones. When we are sick or injured, we trust doctors to call upon their vast knowledge of the human body to make us feel better, and in many cases, to keep us alive. This, however, is a story of a doctor who did the exact opposite of what he was supposed to. Harold Shipman took advantage of the tremendous power he held over his patients in order to victimize them. He murdered hundreds of them in a grisly career that spanned over 2 decades, for no apparent reason other than because he could. For a long time, he was able to get away with it, using the exalted position his profession held in society to assure grieving relatives that their loved ones had died a natural death in order to conceal his guilt. What made Shipman so much more insidious than other serial killers was that he wasn't killing strangers. He was beloved by his patients. His victims welcomed him into their homes and willingly rolled up their sleeves to receive the injection that would end their lives. He preyed on some of the most vulnerable members of society, elderly women who lived alone. Only after he was caught did people realize the enormity of what he had done. His body count marks him as the world's most prolific serial killer. That's not hyperbole either. The sudden death of 81-year-old Kathleen Grundy on June 24, 1998 was a shock for her friends and neighbors. Grundy was a well-known figure in her hometown of Hyde, a typical English town located some 15 kilometers east of Manchester. Her late husband, John, had served as the town's mayor, and Kathleen spent decades involved in local government and charity work. She was also the very picture of health, despite her advanced age. She still drove, gardened, and was generally an active member of the community. Still, most people around Hyde eventually shrugged off the death of Mrs. Grundy. After all, old people just passed away sometimes, even without showing outward signs of being ill beforehand. But for Grundy's daughter, Angela Woodruff, something was definitely not right. The point of contention, at least for the moment, was Mrs. Grundy's will. It had been changed almost immediately before her death, leaving the entirety of her £400,000 estate worth £750,000, $950,000 today, not to her family, but to her doctor, Harold Shipman. Woodruff, a solicitor who routinely handled her mother's legal business, suspected this new will was a forgery, so she went to the police, as one does, who began an investigation. There were almost immediate red flags. The signature on the will did not match known samples of Mrs. Grundy's handwriting, and the 2 witnesses to the will reported to police that they hadn't actually seen Mrs. Grundy sign anything. They didn't even know her. They were fellow patients of Dr. Shipman's, asked to sign what they believed was a routine medical form, not a will. Police were convinced the will was a fraud, and the obvious suspect in the forgery was Dr. Shipman, a respected general practitioner, or GP, in Hyde with a thriving practice. With that much money at stake, and with Mrs. Grundy's death being both sudden and unexpected, it was not that much of a leap to speculate that Shipman was responsible for the old woman's death. What the investigation would ultimately uncover, however, would be far, far worse. Looking at it from the outside, it was hard to imagine Harold Frederick Shipman, known to his family and friends as Fred, as being anything but an upstanding member of society. He was born into a working-class family in the English city of Nottingham in 1946. His father was a truck driver who had just returned from military service during World War II. The most important person in young Fred Shipman's life was his mother, Vera. He was her favorite child, the one who was expected to go on to do great things, and she raised him to believe that he was better, smarter than the people around him. When Shipman was 17, she died after a long battle with lung cancer, a loss which left a profound effect on him, as we'll get into later. Shipman decided to become a doctor, graduating from Leeds University Medical School in 1970. While he was at university, he met his wife Primrose and married her after getting her in the family way, as the expression went in those days. The couple would have 4 children together. The only legal blemish on Dr. Shipman's record came in 1975 when he was working as a GP in the town of Todmorden. He was caught forging prescriptions in order to acquire large amounts of the painkiller pethidine, better known by the brand name Demerol. When questioned by police and his colleagues, Shipman admitted that he had become addicted to the drug back at university and it had been growing worse ever since. Dr. Shipman pled guilty to several charges relating to his illegal possession of the drug and was fined. He was also required to check himself into a drug rehabilitation clinic. Having lost his job, Shipman needed a fresh start, and he eventually got it when he moved to a general practice in Hyde in 1977. Hyde sits on the eastern edge of the Greater Manchester area and was best known for being the site of the Moors murders, one of the most infamous crimes in British history. A couple, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, murdered 5 children and buried most of their bodies in a nearby moor, being caught red-handed with a dead body in their house in Hyde in 1965. It was an ironic twist considering what Shipman would go on to do. Over the course of the next 2 decades, Fred Shipman became one of the most respected doctors in Hyde. His patients adored him. He was viewed as one of the last of a dying breed of old-fashioned doctors who worked to maintain a personal relationship with his patients. Consultations always ran long because he would sit and talk with the patient for as long as they liked, listening to them about anything and everything, even if it was totally unrelated to their health. He remembered important dates in his patients' lives, such as birthdays and anniversaries. He even made house calls, a practice unheard of in this day and age. He was practically popular with older patients, especially women. However, he was not universally popular. People who worked with him and for him, like receptionists, reported that he was a bully. He seemed to have an incessant need to prove that he was smarter than everyone else in the room, being particularly dismissive of people who he believed were beneath him. He angered his former partners at the Donnybrook Medical Center when he absconded with his patient list and went into business for himself in 1993, cheating the other doctors out of thousands of pounds in the process. Still, in spite of his shortcomings, nobody believed this man could actually be a murderer. Kathleen Grundy's cause of death was old age, according to her death certificate. A certificate that was, by the way, signed by one Dr. Harold Shipman. It was all a little too convenient for police, who determined that they needed to make the difficult decision to exhume Mrs. Grundy's body from her grave in order to conduct an autopsy. In the middle of the night, exactly 1 month after being buried, the coffin was dug up. Staff at a neighboring nursing home, seeing all the flashing lights bobbing around the cemetery, actually called 999, the UK's emergency number, to report what they thought might be grave robbers. The forensic pathologist could find no immediate physical cause for Mrs. Grundy's death. There was no sign of a heart attack or a stroke, no sign of injury or trauma. Tissue samples were taken to a laboratory for testing. Unlike on TV crime shows where results are delivered in minutes, it took another month for the results to come back, and the results revealed that there had been enough morphine in her body to cause a fatal overdose. Dr. Shipman came up with a ludicrous defense for why there was so much morphine in Mrs. Grundy's body. She was a drug addict. He produced medical records as proof to his claims, but this was the early era of computer forensics, so it was easy to determine that those additions had been made to her medical records after her death. On September 7, 1998, Shipman was arrested on suspicion of murder. It seemed like a pretty open and shut case of a doctor who killed an old lady in an attempt to steal her wealth for himself. However, police also began to look at other, far more disturbing reports surrounding Dr. Shipman. Multiple people came forward to talk about the rather alarming number of patients of his that died suddenly and unexpectedly. One taxi driver said that 20 of his clients, who were all Shipman patients, had died. The local undertaking firm had a story too. Over the years, they'd been called to a number of addresses to pick up the bodies of Shipman patients who died. Unusually, almost all of them were found in armchairs or on couches, fully dressed with a sleeve rolled up like they'd been preparing to receive an injection. Often, the doctor himself was the one to discover the body, or else he was the last person to see them alive. In all cases, Shipman signed off on the death certificate, attributing their death to natural causes and assuring the grieving family members that an autopsy wasn't necessary. It seemed as though Mrs. Grundy's death might only be the tip of a very large iceberg. Police pored over the death records of Dr. Shipman's patients, trying to find any other potential victims. Between September and December of 1998, 12 more bodies were exhumed, the oldest of which had died 5 years earlier. Fortunately for police, morphine, unlike other drugs, does not disappear from a human body quickly after death. It can still be found in tissue years after the body has been dead and buried. In each case, the cause of death was determined to be a fatal dose of morphine. There was a clear pattern in the victims. Most of them were elderly women who lived alone. All of them had been Dr. Shipman's patients for years. He knew them, had visited their houses on multiple occasions. It would not have been suspicious for Shipman to pay them a house call. In some cases, they'd made an appointment for him to do so. Nor would it have been difficult to convince them to accept an injection from him. All he'd have to do is tell them that it was a flu vaccine, or a vitamin B12 shot, or some other routine procedure. The only small comfort for family members was that their relatives had died painlessly. The victims simply went to sleep and never woke up. Police eventually charged Dr. Shipman with 15 murders. The press had a field day with the story. It was headline news not only in the UK, but all over the world. Tabloids competed with each other for the best nickname for Shipman. The most popular were Dr. Death and the Angel of Death. Already, there was speculation that the true number of victims was far higher than what he was being charged with. What no one could figure out, though, was what Shipman's motive was. Unlike with Mrs. Grundy, the other victims did not leave large sums of money to the doctor. In some cases, cash or costume jewelry had gone missing, but those seemed more like trophies than a true financial motive. It seems that the doctor, like other serial killers, did it just because he could, because he got a rush out of playing God, holding the power of life and death in his hands. Many were quick to connect the deaths of the women to the death of Shipman's own mother. When she was dying of cancer, the family GP would come and give Vera Shipman injections of morphine in order to make her more comfortable. However, this was not a euthanasia case, unlike the American doctor Jack Kevorkian, who was jailed the same year for physician-assisted suicide. None of Shipman's victims were terminally ill. Most of them were, in fact, in perfect health. Not all of them were even elderly. The youngest person Shipman was charged with killing was 49 years old. Harold Shipman went on trial on October 5th, 1999. The case had been moved to the city of Preston because it was felt that it would be impossible to find an impartial jury in Manchester. There was no physical evidence directly tying Shipman to the murders, and no witnesses who actually saw him inject any of the victims with the morphine that killed them. However, the amount of circumstantial evidence was as enormous as it was damning. Prosecutors showed the jury copious amounts of pathological evidence from the autopsies, medical records that had been forged by hand as well as electronically, evidence showing Mrs. Grundy's forged will was typed on a typewriter in Shipman's possession, and witness after witness who reported Dr. Shipman's unusual behavior on the day the victims died, claiming to have called for an ambulance when he hadn't, asserting that he had tried resuscitating the victims when he hadn't, insisting that an autopsy wasn't necessary, even pushing to have the bodies cremated, which would have destroyed any evidence he had killed him. As for where Shipman acquired the large amount of morphine he would have needed to kill this many victims, it appears that it came from a combination of sources. Most of it came from forged prescriptions. He would order ampules of morphine on behalf of patients who never received it or received much less than what he ordered. A similar tactic to what he'd gotten into trouble for in Todmorden in 1975. He would also collect leftover drugs from patients who had died, and instead of disposing them, like you're supposed to do, he kept them. In one exceptionally cruel case, he convinced a man he was dying of cancer, prescribing him large amounts of morphine, while ordering still more that he never gave him, only to tell him over a year later that he wasn't even sick. By that time, the man had a debilitating opioid addiction and had lost his job. Against this mountain of evidence, Shipman put up a rather lackluster defense. Shipman himself testified on his own behalf, asserting that he was innocent and that all of his victims had died of natural causes. On cross-examination, he was unable to explain why so much morphine was in the bodies of so many victims he just happened to have come across the day they died, among other inconsistencies. Still, it took the jury 6 full days of deliberating before delivering their verdict. Guilty on all counts. And it was the first time in the history of British medicine that a doctor had been convicted of deliberately murdering his patients. And he was sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed under British law, a whole life tariff, meaning that he would spend the rest of his days behind bars. He was assigned to HM Prison Wakefield in West Yorkshire, known as the Murder Mansion because it houses some of Britain's most notorious criminals. But this would not be the end of the Shipman story. Following Shipman's conviction, a public inquiry chaired by High Court Justice Janet Smith was convened, both to determine the extent of Shipman's crimes and whether any of the regulatory authorities or other bodies could have prevented them. The work was difficult, encompassing more than 2 decades of witness statements and medical records. Hundreds of patients of his had died. The trick was to try and figure out if those deaths were natural or caused by Shipman. Many of his potential victims had been cremated, making forensic examination impossible. In any event, it was decided not to exhume any further bodies. Shipman was already in prison. There was to be no more trials. The inquiry would have to proceed without them. The conclusions weren't just horrifying, they were historic. The inquiry determined with a high degree of probability that Dr. Shipman had killed at least 200 more people than what he was convicted of, going all the way back to the 1970s, but particularly accelerating after he went into solo practice in 1993. By the time he was caught, Shipman was killing up to 7 patients a month. The official count stands at 218 dead, far and away the most prolific serial killer in history. The true number of victims, however, will never be known. It is speculated that he could have killed more, as many as 250, even 300 people. The inquiry recommended major changes to be made in the process of certifying deaths in the UK, particularly cremation orders, as well as regulating the prescription of restricted drugs like morphine, and that single doctor practices should be either discouraged or more closely overseen by the General Medical Council in order to prevent something like this from happening ever again. By the time the final report of the Shipman inquiry was published in January 2005, Harold Shipman was dead. On January 13, 2004, Shipman was found hanged in his cell, having tied a noose around the window bars of his cell using his bed sheets. The deadly doctor had claimed his final victim, aged 57. His death produced a mixed reaction in the UK, with some celebrating his death while others, particularly family members of victims, were angry that Shipman had died without admitting any part of his guilt. Shipman's body was kept for more than a year while his family tried to figure out what to do with it. They were advised against burying him for fear that the grave would be attacked by vengeful relatives. It was eventually cremated in March 2005, conducted in private and attended only by his wife and children. Primrose Shipman stood by her husband to the end, publicly stating her belief in his innocence. Because of the persistent fear of reprisal attacks by victims' relatives or would-be vigilantes, Primrose's car was stolen and one of the children was attacked in the street, the British government gave Primrose and the couple's 4 children new identities. They have vanished into anonymity. In 2005, a memorial to Shipman's victims, the Garden of Tranquility, opened in Hyde. Its designer said it was a place for people to reflect on life and enjoy the open space. Angela Woodruff, the daughter of Kathleen Grundy, Shipman's last victim, was in attendance at the opening. There has been so much speculation surrounding why Harold Shipman, who had avoided detection as a serial killer for so many years, would do something so amateurish as to forge Mrs. Grundy's will and attempt to get his hands on her assets after killing her. One possible theory is that he was attempting to retire and leave the country, figuring the heat was on him from so many unexplained deaths, and that in his exceptional arrogance, he actually believed he could get away with it, like he'd gotten away with everything else throughout his life. Another possibility is that, as incredible as it sounds, Shipman actually wanted to get caught. Why? Recognition. After all, what is the point of being the world's most prolific serial killer if nobody even knows that you're doing it? One thing is for sure. If he hadn't forged that will, there is a very distinct possibility that Shipman would have gone on killing and that he would have gone to his grave without anyone knowing all the terrible things he had done. Harold Shipman was a perversion of everything a doctor is supposed to be. Instead of helping his patients, he harmed them, cruelly ending their lives without any remorse, all while pretending to be his patient's friend, even as he stuck the needle in their arm. His list of victims goes far beyond 200. It includes thousands of grieving relatives and friends who had to endure the trauma of their loved one's death, and then a second trauma when it was revealed, in many cases years later, that they had been murdered. The clearest recognition of the enormity of his crimes is that one of the most popular nicknames for him, the Angel of Death, was also given to another doctor, Joseph Mengele, the Nazi physician at Auschwitz concentration camp. I hope you learned something new today, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to deploy a like and comment who you think the scariest serial killer of all time is. Does Dr. Harold Shipman have anything on Ted Bundy? And be sure to share this video with someone who loves learning about true crime, historical figures, and the glory of Rome. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.